All right, y'all. So we are going to continue on with the Beatryce prophecy. We are on chapter 38. And so they set the four of them, 5 if you count the goat. And who would not count the goat? Beatryce rested her hand on Answelica's head with the other hand, and she kept hold of Brother Edic, and they sat in the hollow of the great tree. They sat gathered around the flame of the candle, and the flame threw their shadows up behind them. There were moments whenever the shadows looked bigger, much bigger than themselves were, and then, too, sometimes their shadows seemed to shrink. Big, small, their 5 shadows moved against the trunk of the tree. Beatryce told Brother Edic of all what she remembered, her brothers and the tutor and the soldier and the seahorse falling to the ground. How then did you find your way to the monastery? Said Brother Edic. She shook her head. I cannot say I do not remember. Brother Edic turned to Jack Dory. He said, And you, Jack Dory, are being tutored by Beatryce? I, said Jack Dory, and when she does not fall asleep, I am tutored. He smiled, and then he could not help it. He said aloud the letters of the alphabet, one after the other, in the order that Beatryce had told him. He remembered them exactly. He knew nothing, Brother Edic, said Beatryce. The people do not know how to read or write. And what of this prophecy, said Cannock. Shall we not speak of that? The shadows on the wall danced. Is it about Beatryce, the prophecy? Said Jack Dory. Does it mean that she will rule the land? I don't believe there has ever been a queen, said Brother Edic. Perhaps it is time, said Cannock. After so many kings. Beatryce sat with her hand on Answelica's head, and she looked impossibly small and so bald, not at all like someone who would unseat a king. I do not want to be a queen, said Beatryce. I want only to find my mother and to look the king in the eye and hear him say what he has done. Besides, Beatryce, Answelica held her hand high. Her strange eyes glowed. Does this prophecy mention a goat? Said Jack Dory. It does not mention a goat, said Brother Edic. How can it be true and accurate and how can it be a true and accurate prophecy without mentioning the goat? Said Jack Dory. Cannock laughed, and Brother Edic smiled. But Beatryce looked at them and said, The prophecy confirms it. I must go to the king. Her jaw nodded. There was a look on her face that Jack Dory had learned to recognize and be wary of. Some in the world are certain that they have their own way, said Jack Dory under his breath. That is what Greenie Bipspeak would have said had she been here. What is that? Said Beatryce. What did you say? Not, said Jack Dory. She glared at him. The goat, of course, glared at him too. It was terrible and overwhelming to have both of their ferocious looks trained upon him at the same time. It is only that you promised to teach me to read, said Jack Dory. And also, said Brother Edic, you promised me the story of my mermaid. Yes, she said, it is true, I did promise, and I promised both of those things. Chapter 39. It was late at night. They were all asleep in Cannock's tree. But Beatryce could not sleep. She could not keep herself from sorting through what she knew and did not know, and what she had dreamed and what she remembered. For instance, she had not told the others that she remembered standing up. Once it was silent. Once the only sound in the world was the beating of her own heart. She had stood up and walked away from her brothers and the tutor. Who would want to admit to such a thing, to walk away from people you loved? But she had done it. She had stood up and walked away. Nor did she tell them what she had dreamed. The cliff and the sea and her long hair and the wind in her face and Answelica beside her and Jack Dory coming toward her. The dream of the future. She was sure of it. If the prophecy was about her, she must face it. She did not want to be queen, but she still had to go to the king. She had to find her mother, and yet she had promised Brother Edic that she would write the story of his mermaid. And there was Jack Dory to consider, his face open alight as she told him each of the letters and how they would be combined to name the world. She had promised him too. She put out her hand out and touched Answelica's bony, warm head, and the goat's eyes opened and looked into hers. Planets, other worlds. Beatryce remembered again, standing in the morning darkness with the tutor, holding the magic glass and staring up at the glowing planet. Do you think that the people on this other world are standing and looking through a magic glass at us? She said to the tutor. Could it be that they are wondering about us even as we are wondering about them? The tutor put a hand on her shoulder. Beatryce, he said. Yes? Your father was a great man of mind. He believed very much in knowledge and learning. She did not look away from the planet. She kept the glass pointing at the sky, and she could feel her hand tremble. I did not know him, she said. He died, and I have no memory of him. He wanted you to know as much as could be known, said the tutor. It is your birthright. That is what he believed. I want to learn. I will teach you everything I can, everything I am able, so that if a different day comes, you will be ready. But he hadn't taught her everything he could. He had been killed before he could do that, and the king had ordered him killed. On the day, and the day had come, hadn't it? The different day had come. She must be ready now. There was, in truth, no time to waste, and she would not keep the promises that she had made. At least she could not keep them now. She stood, and in the darkness of Cannock's tree, the goat stood too. "Shh," said Beatryce. "Come." Together she and the goat stepped around the sleeping forms of Cannock, Brother Edic, and Jack Dory. They went through the small door into the great darkness outside, and Beatryce stood for a moment and looked up. She saw the stars, hundreds of them, thousands of them, and she thought she saw a planet. Surely there was a planet up there too, looking down at her. And then, without warning, the stars disappeared. The world became nothing but darkness, and there was an overwhelming swell of mold and blood. "Don't make a sound," said a voice. She was pulled into the tighter into the darkness. Did she call out? She did not. She knew what had happened. She knew who had come for her. Chapter 40. The goat stood over Jack Dory. Her breath was hot on his face. She said nothing, and she was capable of saying nothing. She was only a goat, but he woke to her bright eyes staring at him, and it was as good as if she had spoken. "Now is the time for that sword, you." Jack Dory reached for the sword. He wrapped his hand around the hilt and leapt into his feet. He stood, breathing hard, holding the sword in front of him, and he looked around in the darkness. Brother Cannock, Edic, and Swellica. But there was no Beatryce. His heart was beating fast, slamming against the walls of his chest. "Beatryce," he shouted, and the goat butted her head up against his legs, pushing him forward. He bent and went through the door and out into the world where the stars were shining magnificently differently. "Beatryce," Jack Dory shouted again. He heard rustling, the sound of branches breaking, and the goat butted her head into his right leg, and she looked at him with desperate eyes. And Swellica knew what had happened, but she could not say it. Brother Edic came out of the door in the tree. Behind him was Cannock, and the two men were nothing but shadows in the darkness under the bright stars, and they were all nothing but shadows. "She's gone," said Jack Dory. He thought he might cry, and the sword felt cold in his hands, worthless. Cannock put his hand on Jack Dory's shoulder. "We will find her," he said. "We three will go and find her," said Brother Edic. Swellica made a small, strange noise. "We four," said Cannock. "We four will find her." Jack Dory stood holding the sword, and it was a heavy thing. His heart was heavy too. It too was a heart full of too many things. It carried the letters of the alphabet waiting to be fashioned into words. It carried Greedy Bipspeak and his parents and Beatryce. How much could a heart hold? The bee buzzed around his head, and he looked down at Swellica, and her eyes spoke up to him. They said, "Now hurry. There is no time to waste. We must go to the castle of the king." The goat was in his heart too. Seemingly the heart could hold an untold amount of things, letters and people and goats and bees. Seemingly there was no limit to what it could contain. Jack Dory lifted the sword. The blade of it gleamed in the light of the indifferent stars. "We must go now," Jack Dory said to the others. And then he repeated what the goat had told him, what he knew to be true. "There is no time to waste. We must go to the castle of the king." And that was chapter 40.